What is Urban View?
Where talk empowers and becomes action.
Lawyers, journalists, activists
gather daily to dissect and understand and intellectualize around issues and ultimately shape a better world.
Inspiration that people need to build the lives that they want to live.
It is about freedom, moving people in the right direction, and it is about a unity and a vision of Urban View.
It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your age, politics, your race. It impacts all of us.
At Urban View, you get to see that play out every day. This is a community.
And it's one of the reasons why Urban View is so vitally necessary for this time.
We are not in this journey alone.
And that's how we empower our listeners.
So come on home to Urban View,
where talk empowers and becomes action.
What a blessing it is to be in a space that can do all of that.
That's Urban View, SiriusXM Channel 126 and the SiriusXM app. Free with all of our trials and popular plans.
Never gonna stop. Get down. Music defines a generation. Music is a soundtrack of revolution. Music is a soundtrack of movement. Music is a soundtrack of cause. There is an intersection of politics and pop culture that you didn't even know existed. There's some boy, some girl sitting in a cubicle along K Street, somewhere in D.C. A boy, a girl sitting in a cubicle along a hill with a Capitol with a dome who has single-handedly decided what you wore today. Whoa.
Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
What's up, world? It's your boy, Mike Muse. Welcome to the conversation, the Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be with you all today. Happy Saturday, everyone. I hope you guys had a great week. I hope you guys are having a really fantastic weekend, and I hope you're staying dry wherever you are. There's some crazy weather conditions that have been happening this week. My mom called me late the other night saying there's a tornado or a siren that was going off in the Midwest, and so I do know that people are experiencing crazy weather out there. But nonetheless, it's springtime. It's almost Memorial Day. It's almost a big barbecue season. It's almost summer season. I cannot wait. I am so excited, and it's been so great rocking with you guys all week long. And you guys really loved last weekend's show, which I'm so excited that you guys was able to learn a lot from that. That's been the takeaway, that individuals learned a lot. And I think you guys are all looking at beef differently now as you head to the grocery stores and begin to stock up to make your hamburger patties next weekend for Memorial Day. What's good? I am super excited for this week ahead. It's like, I don't know, I get antsy right around the Memorial Day weekend. And I'm just like, finally, summer is here. I look forward to summer, so I'm super excited about that. I will be joined by the incredible, the talented Karen Pittman. She is here to talk about her new series called Forever on Netflix. That is created and produced by Mara Brock Akil. I'm so excited to be in conversation with her. But before we do that, listen, there's just so much here to unpack. I just kind of want to just get straight to it because we have an incredible show lined up for you today. Listen, let's just get to it. Politics was a crazy week. It was a whiplash week from everything that was happening in the Supreme Court to Saudi Arabia to the Middle East to Qatar to Diddy it was just a lot. But let's begin with a story that in many ways is a different kind of rewrite. Right? And that's kind of how I've been thinking about it. It's a legal attempt to rewrite what it means to be an American. Two cases that are now before the United States Supreme Court. One is about birthright citizenship, and the other is about the use of an Alien Enemies Act. Have the potential to change not just policy, folks, but constitutional relationship between the president and the courts. I watched the case go forward regarding the birthright citizenship, and I was widely fascinated. If you ever get the chance, try and tune in to the Supreme Court hearings. You can't visually see it because there's no cameras allowed into the Supreme Court, but you hear the audio, and it's fascinating how the justices ask questions, how they're thinking, how the Solicitor General presents the case, how the attorneys representing the other side present the case. It's a fascinating way to really learn the judicial system and really to see our democracy in action, in particular because the Supreme Court matters so much here in the United States, particularly now during this time period. So I think it's really cool for us to pay attention to see how it's done and to see that our democracy forming and reshaping right before our eyes as they are one of the guardrails for good or for bad. But this case comes down between the executive action and individual rights, and ultimately between the nation and its most vulnerable residents. I'm really trying to go in the beginning of this conversation. I kind of just want to set the stage for what's at stake and how we got here. I think a lot of people don't understand that the 14th Amendment, because that's where the debate begins. The 14th Amendment, ladies and gentlemen, was born out of the Civil War. It was written to correct the injustices of the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, which said black people, even free black people, could not be citizens of the United States. In response to that, the nation passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, establishing that, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens, end quote. Folks, it's one of the clearest statements of inclusion in the Constitution, in particular as we're thinking about the backdrop of diversity, equity, inclusion. The case is called Dred Scott versus Sanford, but I'm sure you probably heard the term just Dred Scott. And going forward in the future, when you hear the case, the Dred Scott case, now you'll know this is what it's referring to. Really was regarding black people. But now that clarity is being questioned. President Donald Trump, in his second term, right, has issued an executive order that denies birthright citizenship to children born in the United States to undocumented immigrants or those on temporary visas. It's not new rhetoric from Trump. He teased this move going back to his first campaign, but now it's policy because of the executive order. But here's a kicker. This isn't just about who is a citizen, right? It's about how far a president can go to change constitutional interpretations without going through Congress or the constitutional amendment process. Before we get into that, I kind of just want to talk about the theory behind Trump's move. It comes from a once fringe school of thought advanced by individuals like John Eastman, that name's ring a bell for you now, who is best known for helping construct the legal scaffolding behind the attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Eastman and others argue that the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to children of undocumented immigrants because their parents aren't fully subject to U.S. jurisdiction. But, folks, this theory has long been dismissed in legal circles until now. So I think a lot of us are in disbelief that this can go from the fringe to the Supreme Court, and how we even got here and what is essentially going to be the role of the Supreme Court and how they're thinking about this. So let's really begin to unpack, inside those halls, those gilded halls of the Supreme Court, where earlier this week, the justices heard oral arguments. It was on Thursday, actually, heard oral arguments about whether federal district judges have the authority to issue nationwide injunctions to block Trump's birthright executive order. Not yet about the order's constitutionality, but whether a single judge can freeze presidential action across the country. That is key. Really what's being pulled out of that is this idea of court shopping. And I want to be clear, every president has an issue with this, right? Every president has an issue with court shopping. Typically, if it's a Democratic president that is in office, typically those in opposition to policies and laws that have been created by a Democratic-controlled Congress or the Democratic president, individuals typically tend to go to more of conservative district courts, think like Texas, in order for that judge to be favorable, because they're more than likely have been appointed by a Republican president to be favorable to their cause. If it is a Republican that is in the Oval Office and or a Republican-controlled Congress that has passed laws, individuals in protest and trying to undo what's been done will go to, district courts like in San Francisco, right, and in Washington. Those courts that are more progressive and liberal-leaning because those judges have been appointed by a Democratic president. And so there is this idea of court shopping that you're probably going to hear a lot more often. But this is kind of the frustration that is behind President Trump and also, too, all the previous presidents about how certain courts can stop, injunctions from moving forward. So at its core, this is really about like national injunctions, right? Because if the court rules against nationwide injunctions, it will severely limit how quickly courts could stop a president from enforcing policies, even ones that might be unconstitutional. It's not about the 14th Amendment directly, as of now, keyword, as of now, but it does set the stage ahead. Just to put this in the air, every lower court has rejected this idea, and every court has rejected this idea of contesting what the 14th Amendment is and the idea of birthright citizenship. But as I said before, I watched the whole proceedings, and it was fascinating. So I want to just pull out, if you allow me, some of the key exchanges that took place in the court. The first one came from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson when she asked the Trump administration's lawyer, the Solicitor General, John Sauer, who I mentioned to you guys earlier. The Solicitor General goes on behalf of the administration. She asked him what would happen, right, if the court agreed with him. Would every individual harmed by the executive order need to sue separately? She warned that this would turn the justice system into a, quote, catch-me-if-you-can regime. I'm sure you probably heard that trending after she made that comment, where rights violations continue until every single person affected brings their own case, right? That goes to the court shopping case I was talking about in terms of how this administration, if we use this administration specifically, how they will go to different courts to find the one that will allow them and to move forward with executive order of like birthright citizenship. And that's kind of when you think about the challenge that could be of a patchwork of states, that certain states may allow birthright citizenship, other states may not, right? So that's kind of what Justice Jackson is talking about when it comes to the catch me if you can. Justice Elena Kagan pressed further, and she said, quote, "Assume you're dead wrong," she said. "How do we get to the result that this policy is legal? What's the process?" Really, folks, this is the heart of the case. How do you stop unconstitutional behavior in real time when people are already being harmed, right? That is the crux of this whole case and scenario. Justice Sonia Sotomayor stated directly that the order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents. She pointed to Wong Kim Art in 1898, which upheld the birthright of a man born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants. But obviously there's a liberal wing of the Supreme Court, but then there's also the conservative wing of the Supreme Court. And the conservatives floated alternatives. Take Justice Brett Kavanaugh suggested the use of class action lawsuits as a replacement for nationwide injunctions. That would allow courts to issue broad relief without a single judge acting unilaterally. But critics, including conservative Justice Barrett, question the practicality of this, especially when time is urgent and real lives are on the line. So really, what is this case about? In part, it's about birthright citizenship, but it's also about power, right? It's about the tension between the president and the judiciary. You've heard this term, a constitutional crisis. What happens when the Trump administration doesn't obey the Supreme Court? You've heard this idea of this push and pull of the Trump administration, how they may or may not uphold the opinions handed down from the Supreme Court. This has been a battle that's been brewing between the Trump administration and the judiciary branch. Trump and his legal team are not just arguing about immigration. They're arguing that courts have too much power to stop him. It's a frustration for him. It's no accident that this case landed at the Supreme Court, during a time when Trump is challenging multiple court orders on immigration, on national security, and more. The broader strategy seems really clear. It seems like they're trying to use this case to weaken the ability of judges to block his policies across the board. I mean, because think about it, you always hear this idea that Trump is so mad. He tweets this out, he puts this out on his Truth Social, that how can a judge stop a president's executive order? How can a district judge impede the actions of a president? And to which he would even go further to say that's won the popular vote. Ironically, all the other presidents have said this and felt this way too as well. They just had a different restraint on how they went forward with it. And here's the irony. Trump's team says this is a narrow technical case about judicial procedure, but the justices, especially the liberal wing, they're not buying it because they see what's underneath, an executive order that fundamentally rewrites citizenship. Now that we have unpacked this, I want to switch to, let's take a look at the Aliens Enemy Act, a 200-year-old law being used in ways that it was never intended. While this country focuses on the 14th Amendment, there's a whole another showdown that's unfolding in parallel. And I think you guys are familiar with this. This is Trump's effort to deport Venezuelan migrants under the Alien Enemies Act. It's a law from 1798 that was intended for times of war. Yeah, so I'm going to give you some bit of some context here. The Alien Enemies Act allows the president to detain or deport foreign nationals from countries the U.S. is at war with. It was used during World War II against Germans, Italians, and Japanese citizens. It's a harsh tool, and it's meant for wartime only. But insert plot twist, we're not at war with Venezuela, folks. Still, the Trump administration has argued that certain Venezuelan gang members, specifically from Tren de Aragua, represent a kind of non-traditional invasion, they say. They claim these individuals are de facto agents of a foreign state and thus qualify under the Alien Enemies Act. So, the administration began deporting detainees from a Texas facility with just 24 hours notice, without proper legal representation and without information on how to challenge their removal. Essentially due process, right? And we talked about due process a lot here on the Mike Muse Show. But the Supreme Court stepped in yesterday with a decision. It was breaking news, and they said no. These justices ruled 7-2, and that's an important number, 7-2. There's 9 Supreme Court justices, but the ruling was 7-2. The justices blocked Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act unless and until due process rights are respected. That this opinion, unsigned opinion, but clear, stated that 24-hour notice in English without legal explanation and not shared with attorneys doesn't pass the test. Justice Alito and Thomas, the most conservative of the bench, dissented. So they were the two. Justice Alito and Thomas dissented, but in the 7, you had Barrett, you had Kavanaugh. The two dissenting, Alito and Thomas, they argued the court should stay out of this until the lower courts act. But the majority felt that the harm was too great to ignore. This is important because the case connects directly to the birthright citizenship battle that I was just talking about. Both are about expanding executive power to redefine who belongs in this country. It's about using old laws or vague constitutional theories to do it quickly and to do it without oversight, right? In both cases, Trump is trying to circumvent Congress and rewrite immigration rules through executive action. And in both, the courts are asking, where are the checks? Just to give you context on how it works, if you want to make amendments to the Constitution, you have to have 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate in order to pass a constitutional amendment. But that's not all. If both chambers have passed with 2/3 majority vote, then it has to be cleared by 3/4 of the states. So 3/4 of the states have to then determine that they agree with 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate that this constitutional amendment should be done. The founding fathers really set such a high bar with constitutional amendments to ensure that if this amendment was to go forward, that it was the overwhelmingly will of the people. If not, we'll have constitutional amendments every day, right, to fit the political, expediency of it all. But so the checks are that there are real human consequences, right? In one case, I think we are all heard about this one, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He was mistakenly deported to El Salvador. Despite being part of an ongoing legal challenge, the court cited this mistake as evidence that the current process is just not working, that the system as implemented by the Trump administration is broken. So just like the Birthright case, the Alien Enemies Act ruling isn't a full resolution, but it's a pause. It's a statement that emergency powers don't cancel the Constitution, and I think that is important. No matter how much you feel certain things are emergency, there still is a Constitution that must be abided by. And no matter how much we like it or not, that is what makes America special. It is what makes American exceptional. When you think about American exceptionalism, this is what it comes down to. And this is what you want. It's no different, folks, when you get like a bad email, right? Or a bad text comes in. They always say, right, you want to walk away from your computer, take a beat, take a breath, and give it like 15 minutes before you respond. So you don't respond in haste, right? So think about like that 15 minutes as like the Constitution, right? To give it a beat, to give it a rest, to let cooler heads prevail. And that is why it's important that these emergencies don't cancel the Constitution. So what are we really watching unfold here, right? At first glance, it is about birthright and deportation, but when you zoom out and you'll see something a little bit bigger, it's a power struggle between the executive branch and the judicial branch, as I mentioned. But this is being framed through a lens of immigration. Trump is trying to assert a level of unilateral authority over immigration that no modern president has held, including using this 18th century law in one case and a fringe theory on the 14th Amendment in another. And the Supreme Court is being asked, can the judiciary stop him? Here's what's critical to understand. The 14th Amendment can only be changed through the constitutional amendment process, not through an executive order, as I keep saying. So I just want to keep reiterating that to make sure that you guys are equipped with that knowledge, right? So that in case but you guys are already, the Mike Muse listeners, you guys are already on it. But it's important that we keep doubling down on that as we begin to talk about this, this weekend at brunch, at dinners, barbecues, coming up, that we really talk about that the process requires 2/3 of both the House of Congress and a ratification, both houses of Congress, and the ratification by 3/4 of the state. But what if the court say judges can't block executive orders quickly? What if they, weaken the nationwide injunctions? Follow me with this for a second here, folks. Then we enter a new era, one where a president can act, and by the time a ruling is issued, the damage may already be done, right? If they can't block an executive order. Because think about it, as a president then at that point can do an executive orders over things that are already in the Constitution if a lower court can't block that. And by the time you go through the process of it all, the expediency would have already been done. This is what we mean by saying guardrails, and or in this case, what about due process? If the Alien Enemies Act can be used without war and without clear notice, that opens the door to all kinds of national security justifications for mass deportation. Particularly when migrants are branded as gang members or threats. this is really about the soul of American democracy, right? It's about the difference between law and power, and between citizenship and exclusion. It's between emergency authority and constitutional restraint. And the decision the Supreme Court makes, even if narrow, will set precedents that ripple far beyond, immigration. I think as we're beginning to learn more just how important the Fifth Amendment is, and I think everyone that is listening to my voice right now, you guys already know what due process can be used and how it can be weaponized. A lot of people in America, particularly blacks, did not were not always afforded due process, right? I mean, I think about this Emmett Till, just the idea of what happened to that young man because he was not afforded the proper due process and what the outcomes of that is. How many times have we seen due process not being enacted when black folks get into the judicial system, right? How many times have we seen that? That's why it creates a slippery slope when a president can unilaterally just act without creating due process. And I think that is one of the things that's been troubling me is seeing the commentary about how people have been willing to look away from the violation of the Fifth Amendment and all in service and in revelry for President Trump. That is what concerns me. I think both can be true, right? A supporter can enjoy and like President Trump, but then also, too, they can't be so far into the liking that they lose sight of due process, right? That's just so important because if we don't have due process, you really change what it is to be an American. It really changes what makes America so special is that we do have that due process. And even if the Supreme Court rules, they're not necessarily going to rule on the birthright citizenship to give the opinion because that's already settled. They're going to really examine if a lower court or if a judge can stop an executive order. And I think that is what's going to be important. And I'll look at it in terms of, to use a neutral example here, when you think about this, when it comes to court shopping, right? Think about it as like content moderation. I've always said that we have to be careful when we flag something on the internet, on YouTube or on X that we find offensive, maybe because like white supremacy, right? There's something about white supremacy. And, a black person goes to flag it and asks YouTube or Google or Twitter to take it down because it's offensive. The other side can do the same. The other side can say Black Lives Matter may be offensive, and so they can ask that to be taken down. And so this is why it's important that when you have rulings, when you look at the guidelines and the guardrails of content moderation, when you have rulings and guardrails of our Constitution, no matter if we like the outcomes of these things or not, it's important that the guardrail is there and the guardrail is in place so that it doesn't continuously create this whiplash effect of the political headwinds of the time and of the moment. Because there will be a time where President Trump will leave office. He technically can only do one more term. So I don't know how they're going to keep pushing this narrative that he go for a third term. But again, constitutionally, there's two, but it's going to possibly could be tested. We'll see. I don't want to dive down that rabbit hole. But the point being, he won't be president at some point. And it's just the same as Obama was only president 2 terms. Right? Biden was only president 1 term. Right? Bush got his 2 and Bush Jr. But it's the idea that presidents come and go. And you want to make sure that the Constitution stays forever. And that the Constitution isn't responding to political ideology of the moment. Because clearly the Republican ideology of now of MAGA is completely different all the way from the Tea Party, which is all the way different from the Mitt Romney type Republicans and the Bush type Republicans, right? And so you don't want the Constitution to swing with that. even within the Democratic circles, what Clinton did, it was completely different than what Obama did, which is completely different than what Biden did. And so whoever becomes president next, you don't want that policies in the Constitution to be reactive to what's happening in the moment. So this is why these cases are so important and are so critical. But at least we got that decision yesterday that the Supreme Court has continuously blocked Trump's position on the Aliens Enemy Act, but has given instructions on how they may proceed with, giving them the right amount of time and opportunity for due process. So that's it, folks. Let's keep paying attention to that. There's going to be so much more to unpack. But coming up after the break, we're going to do a little bit of a pivot. We're going to bring some fun. We're going to bring some laughter. I'll say right there, and we'll be right back.